thanks very much everyone for joining us for today's BGSS webinar, the next in our series of Agile surgery. We are recording today's session, so if anybody does join late or misses anything, you will be able to follow up afterwards. Obviously, you had the opportunity to submit questions beforehand. However, please do use the Q&A functionality as we go throughout the talk, and there will be a session at the end where feel free to ask any questions that you've got. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Hannah Elston, our Delivery Manager Capability Lead in Leeds, and she'll introduce today's Agile surgery.
Thanks, Karen. So hi everyone, thank you for joining us today for our second online BGSS Agile surgery. We started the Agile surgery last year, and we're really pleased to say that it's been really popular, and today is actually our 5th event overall. We're really excited to welcome back lots of familiar names on the list, which is great, and also to extend obviously a very warm welcome to those of you if it's your first surgery today. And hopefully you'll enjoy today and come back for future surgeries next month onwards. So I think first of all it'd be good if we could just have some time for the team to introduce themselves. So I may as well start first. So I'm Hannah Elston, as Karen said. I'm the Delivery Management Capability in Leeds. I'm also a squad lead, which is all around our pastoral care for our people, and I'm also a hands-on delivery manager. So Craig, would you like to go next to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi guys. My name's Craig Howarth. I'll have been with BGSS for 6 years next week, and I'm the Leeds Capability Lead for Agile.
Thanks, Craig. And we've got Charlotte.
Hi, so I'm Charlotte Sutton. I'm a delivery manager here at BGSS as well as a squad lead, and I've been with the company now for 3.5 years.
And Leah.
Hi everyone, my name is Leah Unsworth-Hughes and I've worked at BGSS as a business analyst for 8 months.
And last but not least, we've got Donna.
Hi everyone, I'm Donna Tosney. I'm a delivery manager at BGSS in Leeds and also a squad lead, and I've been with BGSS for coming up to 2 years.
Great, thanks everyone. So today, as you can see from the title, we're going to be talking about the topic of real-world sprint challenges. We're going to be comparing some of our realities and our experiences of using Agile and comparing them against sort of the theory. So we really hope you enjoy that content. Craig, if you could click me down, please. Thank you. Okay, so bear in mind we have got a number of people on the call. Hopefully a lot of you already know about BGSS and who we are and what we do, but I just thought it'd be worth just summarising some of that information for you. So BGSS is a company we were formed just over 27 years ago, and we are still privately owned by the founders with still very firm roots in software delivery. Fast forward into 2020, BGSS can be best described as an innovative technology consultancy. We do offer end-to-end delivery all the way from inception through to managed service, and we couple that with having a proven track record of working very collaboratively with our customers, and we really enjoy helping them to deliver complex technology solutions, and with some of our clients that's being used by millions and millions of users every day. We enable transformation through end-to-end solutions that deliver real results. Thanks, Craig. So we'd just like to also share kind of the number of offices we've got. So we have continued to grow rapidly. I mean, I've been with the company 3.5 years and we have grown significantly. We're now up to the size of just over 1,500 people across our 13 offices. For those eagle-eyed will notice there are 12 offices, 12 locations named on this slide. We have got sort of a snippet of information that's being shared widely on Monday, where we are opening our newest office based over in Lisbon, which has been extremely exciting to expand further actually into other countries as well. So that was everything from me. I'm going to hand you over to Craig now, who's going to go through the agenda. I really hope you enjoy the session, and I'll be back again at the end just to host a Q&A session. Okay, thanks everyone, see you later.
Thanks, Hannah. Hi everyone, I'll be introducing today's session and I'll be back at the end to recap. But in the middle, I'll hand over to my colleagues for the important content, really. Before we kick off in earnest, then I'll do my best to ground the session by running you through a brief introduction and taking a look at our exciting sounding good, bad, pretty, and ugly matrix. Once I've walked you through the context, we'll move on to talk about 3 common problem areas: testing, fake news, and scope and shifting priorities. For each one of those, we'll talk through a few scenarios, tactics we've deployed to deal with them, and learnings we can take away. I'll be back towards the end to summarize the day's content in our recap, and then I'll hand back over to Hannah for a round of Q&A to close the session. Right then, I'd like to begin by talking about how the fabled perfect sprint, maybe it does. That doesn't really help us though. And as impressive and admirable as Usain Bolt and the 100-meter dash might be, it's not really even as nuanced as our day today. Moving quickly on then. Okay, so as I mentioned, by way of introduction, I'd like to give some context to what the rest of today's presenters will soon talk you through. We're ostensibly here to talk about what good sprints look like, but we've got to start by acknowledging that the perfect sprint simply doesn't exist. Sure, we can sometimes hit home runs and meet all our extended success criteria, but everything can be improved upon, and what works for one team won't necessarily work for another. It's also fair to say that the theory we learn on our own personal agile learning journeys doesn't fully prepare us for many of the realities, especially those that start appearing as soon as you add humans into the mix. On that basis, we're going to look at a variety of problems that crop up, even in configurations where we've implemented principles to the letter, where these things weren't supposed to happen, but are happening nevertheless. It should go without saying, but nothing that's discussed today should be considered in isolation. We're simply presenting some areas we find are commonly troublesome and sharing some techniques our experience tells us are very helpful in dealing with them. All right then, here's the matrix I mentioned earlier. So the intention of this slide is to help demonstrate how, in the search for the perfect sprint, good and pretty, for example, are often confused and misconstrued. Don't worry about reading everything on the slide. Like Karen mentioned, we are going to distribute those after the session. But just to pick on a couple of areas. Of course, not everything on here marked as good and as ugly will represent your specific project, but they're broadly intended to illustrate where the idealized theory can diverge from what's best for your deliveries. The top right-hand quadrant exemplifies this. We may, for example, deliver every story in our sprint and get a release out on time. Our metrics will look fantastic in our reports and we'll be ticking a bunch of our Scrum theory boxes. Unfortunately, in doing so, we might find we burnt out our team, exhausted any remaining goodwill we have with them, and introduced a whole bunch of technical debt we'll have to pick up or ignore if we're doing this ugly later. Similarly, the bottom left-hand corner, we could have the world's most beautifully refined backlog, be nailing every ceremony, and have definitions of ready and done that are the envy of the whole company, but we're just not delivering. We're all aware agility is far more than a series of tick box exercises and artifacts, but it's really not uncommon to have way too narrow a focus on them regardless. Often the divergence between the theory and the reality occurs because of unforeseen issues, rarely discussed in classrooms, but encountered way more than we'd like in the real world, which leads us nicely into the core of this session, our selection of problem areas and suggestions for real world mitigation. On that, I'll hand you over to Donna to kick us off with testing. Over to you, Donna.
Thank you, Craig. So now we're going to take a look at typical problem areas that can arise from a test perspective. So the first scenario we're going to look at is when a team is more focused on development rather than testing. This can result in the team being set up for success at the beginning of the sprint from a development, but not from a test perspective. So this means that test activities may not be fully understood, resulting in delays for starting and completing user stories, whilst also increasing the risk of not delivering to plan. So let's talk through a few tactics to help combat this scenario. So where possible, complete test-driven proof of concepts. So for example, you may want to undertake a proof of concept for the appropriate test framework to support in that area. This will help to increase the overall understanding of the requirement and can increase the accuracy of estimates and again help to de-risk delivery. Another good tactic to help is during the 3 Amigos session, ensure the solution and the tasks associated with the user story is discussed from both a development and a test perspective. This will help the testers to hit the ground running and allow them to create the test scripts early on within the sprint. So what have we learned around this particular scenario and tactic? Testing cannot be a second priority to development. It's essential to fail fast, and the only way you can do this is by testing at the earliest opportunity. The next scenario is where the resource is unbalanced within a team. So in particular, what we're looking at is where there's not enough test capacity, which obviously puts the sprint performance at risk. So let's look at a couple of tactics to help with this scenario. Where possible, knowledge sharing between roles and empowering T-shaped individuals can be really effective. So ask yourself, Do you have developers in your team that have a good understanding of the test framework and can work alongside test experts to contribute? However, if you are going to do this, make sure you plan ahead and think about the potential impacts on your sprint commitments and velocity. So let's have a look at what we've learned again around this particular scenario and tactic. So what we've learned is that everyone is responsible for quality, and having T-shaped individuals can increase the effectiveness of the team. And the final scenario that we're going to look at is we're going to talk about non-functional tests and how they can sometimes be an afterthought. So what do we mean by non-functional tests? So these tests are carried out to ensure the delivery and the quality of the non-functional requirements. This can mean performance testing, scalability, security, which is all very much dependent on the non-functional requirements captured. We know that many organisations struggle to provide non-functional requirements up front and don't fully understand the impact that this can have further down the line in production. So for example, many companies have struggled with the increase in demand and activities on their e-commerce platforms during COVID. This could have been that the requirements simply didn't cater for the demand, or it was not feasible to run the non-functional tests that met the requirements. So again, let's have a look at a couple of tactics to overcome this. Ensure both the non-functional requirements and associated tests are understood up front. If it's not possible, make sure you at least pull together a baseline set of requirements and cater for these in your plan. Also, make sure you investigate whether it's feasible to deliver the non-functional tests. So for example, is there an environment available that is a clone of live to allow you to run tests in a like-for-like environment? As you can imagine, a dependency of this size can take significant time to unblock. So let's just recap on non-functional tests. So it's essential to understand both the requirements and the associated tests, and make sure it's feasible and the dependencies are understood to deliver the non-functional tests. So that's it from me today. I hope I've shared a few tactics with you from a test perspective that you can take away and apply. And I'm now going to hand over to Charlotte, who's going to talk to you about fake news.
Lovely, thank you, Donna. So as you can see, our next topic is that of fake news. As part of our sprints and projects, we produce a variety of different metrics and reports, but these often don't tell the full story. In this section, we're going to uncover the hidden story behind these headlines. So our first scenario then is a focus on story points. In this example, the team has ramped up to a high velocity, they're completing a high number of stories in each sprint, and our stakeholders are very happy with our progress. However, the issue not shown is the position of technical debt and defects. How much technical debt are we building up in each sprint, rates that we're opening and closing defects, and are we building up a problem for ourselves? The impact is that we can end up with flaky systems which are hard to maintain and our issues manifest in production. So what tactics can we use? Firstly, we can reserve capacity in each sprint for both tech debt and defects. It's not always possible in the real world to do this every single sprint, and sometimes you do just have to do that big push to complete a big delivery, but this should always be the exception and not the rule. We can also agree a sensible definition of done for our stories so that we can help upfront reduce the build-up of your defects and technical debt. We've all worked on projects where either there was no definition of done, so the team has no idea what's expected of them, or that definition of done is so extensive that a team could never hope to complete it within a sprint, let alone a story. Another key tactic is around managing your stakeholders. If you can explain the value of not focusing solely on story delivery in terms of mitigating against production risks and making those systems more maintainable, it helps to set the context and get buy-in from your stakeholders. Finally, ever-increasing velocity looks fantastic on paper, but actually your team is just going to burn out really quickly. So instead of focusing your retrospectives on the traditional what went well, what could we improve, and the resulting actions, why not do a team health check? Understand how your team feels and avoid them disengaging with the goal. So what have we learned? Firstly, what good looks like for you. Our definition of done can evolve as we learn more, and this is okay. The aim is always to have increasing confidence and predictability as we move through our project delivery. Secondly, what does sustainable velocity mean? High and increasing numbers look fantastic on paper, but actually predictability and planning provides greater value in the real world. Finally, when we're working in a scaled agile environment, do not compare apples and oranges. If team A delivers 20 story points in one sprint and team A delivers 80, this does not mean that team B is 4 times more productive. They just estimate differently. So our second scenario then, this is a focus on story points versus features. In this example, again, our team has ramped up velocity. They are completing a high number of stories in each sprint and our stakeholders are happy. The missing context here, however, is the value being delivered to our end users. The risk is that we have a series of components delivered that don't add incremental value and we're not focusing on that shippable increment. So what tactics can we use? Firstly, we need to consider the inputs into the team. Do we have well-defined stories that help us deliver the value through the individual stories and the sum of the parts? If not, we need to focus on what those stories are lacking and how they can be addressed. We also need to define our MVP, so our minimum viable product. With a myriad of requirements and often changing backlogs, it's easy to lose sight of that end goal, but sometimes having that simple end-to-end view of the user journey can help crystallize next steps for both stakeholders and the team. Finally, make sure you implement your feedback loops. Talk to your stakeholders and your users, and it sounds obvious, but invite them to the show and tells to allow you to demonstrate the value that you've added. So from all of this, what have we learned? How to give the team confidence in their delivery. If they're given quality inputs at the start of the sprint and they know the overall aim, we set them up to deliver the quality outputs. We also learn how to give the team a sense of achievement and that positive reinforcement through feedback. Allow your team to own the delivery and take pride in and responsibility for the outputs. Our next scenario then. This focuses on balancing risk and story points. So in this scenario, we set up our project team and our velocity starts low as predicted, but it gradually increases. And again, our stakeholders are happy with the progress. However, we hit an issue, for example, a particularly complex integration, and suddenly not only the sprint, but the project is blocked. Our velocity plummets and our stakeholders are now very unhappy. So how do we tackle this? Firstly, we tackle risk early. At the start of the project, we want to identify those areas that contain the greatest risks, so be it technical complexity or the unknowns, and we tackle these first. It's better to resolve them upfront and de-risk the delivery in the long run than leave them until later and be in that difficult position of replanning. Again, you need to take your stakeholders on the journey. Having that conversation that progress in your early sprints is going to be slow while you tackle these risks is really hard. But by explaining that this gives us increased confidence in our delivery dates as the project progresses, helps those stakeholders to understand and support us. So finally, set the team up to succeed or fail fast. From a morale perspective, especially with a new team, it's better for them to tackle issues together early in the delivery and succeed than to face blockers and challenges in the middle when they think they're on track. So from all of this, what do we learn? How to build an open and honest culture with both our stakeholders and our team, how to pave the way for a smoother delivery, and how to manage those difficult conversations. In the real world, we can't preempt every single challenge, but if we address those that we can anticipate, we again make a smoother way for delivery to proceed. So finally, no news is bad news. We all know the adage that no news is good news, but in the world of delivery, this is rarely the case. So in this scenario, we have had an awful sprint. We haven't completed any stories. Our estimation didn't hold anywhere near true. And we now have numerous new defects on the backlog, which has expanded. The danger we have here is that we shy away from our reporting. We try to quietly move on to the next sprint, but our stakeholders invariably look at the numbers themselves and are disappointed. So what tactics can we use? Most importantly, tell your stakeholders what you're doing and why. If you've hit a really complex area of the code that just wasn't obvious when the work began, tell your stakeholders what the issue was, have your plan on how you can address it going forwards, and what's the impact on the plan as it stands. Secondly, don't fall into the trap of saying that no or low points have been delivered. Give the narrative and help your stakeholders understand those challenges, because they may have some ways to help and support you. So lastly, what have we learned from this? Well, you always learn something. If you've improved your knowledge and the information at your disposal to accurately plan going forwards, this is still a bonus. In the real world, we will be hit by issues in our sprints. What this does teach you though, is how to celebrate the successes of your team. Every small win is still a win. So, in summary, when it comes to fake news, one of the key messages we've seen throughout each of these scenarios is that communication and engagement with both your stakeholders and your team is key. Make sure you're taking them both on that journey so they understand the approach and are bought into helping when those real world issues strike. That's all from me, so I'm now going to hand you across to Leah, who is going to cover scope and shifting priorities.
Thank you, Charlotte. So yeah, as I say, I'm going to be discussing what happens when your scope or priority changes mid-sprint and the different ways of handling that change. So the first scenario that I'm going to go through is a brand new high priority requirement. So in theory, this should never happen. Once you've completed planning and estimation, your sprint should be locked in and thou shalt never change priority mid-sprint. In the real world, that isn't always the case, and changes, both big and small, will always creep in. When this happens, the important thing is to discuss with your stakeholders why this change is being suggested. Is it based on user feedback, market conditions, or do you now have a better understanding of complexity? Having this conversation with a wide forum should reveal the true priority for that change. It's important to consider how much effort this new task will take to complete. Is it an hour's work or is it several days? If you do have some flex in your sprint, you may be able to complete it in addition to your planned work. If not, validate the priority. Could this be a spike or does it need to be dealt with straight away? If not, then add it to the backlog and prioritise it accordingly for the next sprint. If there's just no getting away from pulling this new requirement into the sprint, consider what will be dropped as a result and what impact this will have, not only in terms of delivery, but on the team who've planned, estimated, and worked really hard for this to be dropped. It can be hugely demoralising, and this impact does need to be communicated to your stakeholders. So, what do you learn when you get a brand new requirement dropped into your lap? You learn that pre-sprint analysis is vital. It gives everyone a shared understanding of priority, and it also reduces the likelihood of these new requirements appearing out of the blue. This sets you up for a productive and focused sprint. If change is required, try and manage it between the sprints, and by that I mean try and keep those conversations on the new requirement ongoing where possible to understand the ask, but avoid actively working on it until the next sprint. If there is simply no alternative but to work on this new change straight away, negotiate with your product owner and stakeholders. What are they willing to pause or drop? You know your team's velocity. You cannot do everything. Strongly consider raising this scenario in a retrospective. It's a really good way to share the impact on the team and consider how backlog grooming and pre-sprint analysis can be improved to reduce the likelihood of new requirements coming out of the woodwork in the future. An important point to remember here is managing change is playing back to the team why this change is happening. For example, as a consultancy, we sometimes have no alternative but to manage that change, as implications of not doing it are bigger than a sprint being derailed. For example, we could lose a client could lose their market advantage, or they could fail to meet a regulatory requirement in time. Hopefully, these are all one-off scenarios, but if it does keep happening, you need to push back to your stakeholders, as you can and will lose cadence and morale through context switching. So next, I'd like to cover change to budget and resource. And given the current climate, business priorities can and are changing on a daily basis, and we need to be conscious that the best laid plans can change rapidly. If there is significant change to either the budget or the team's resource mid-sprint, the most sensible action to take would be to cancel the sprint, replan and estimate based on your new circumstances. So we'd suggest reviewing the MVP at that point. Is there any fat that you can trim? What is realistic and achievable in these new circumstances? This needs the whole team to contribute to this conversation, which in itself will take a big chunk of time out of the sprint. Another reason to consider cancelling the sprint. Stringently sticking to your committed scope might not be the right thing to do if you've only days left in your sprint and you've got some really talented T-shaped individuals in your team. Maybe you can still meet your commitments. This is a huge ask on the team, and again, it could have serious impact on their stress levels. So it needs to be discussed and assessed on a case-by-case basis and do what's right for the team in an already stressful situation. Agile, of course, does allow for flexibility. And if it's a less significant change to budget or resource, maybe it can be factored into future plans without impacting on the current sprint. Ultimately though, if the circumstances have changed that significantly, it's time to go back into planning and estimation. So the final scenario I'd like to cover is urgent change to an existing feature or incident. So brand new information has come in, you've had an incident, you've discovered a bug, or you need to update an existing feature as soon as possible. It can often feel like these events throw everything up in the air, but that doesn't always have to be the case. Make sure you do your due diligence and analyse the new requirement and estimate how long it'll take for you to complete. If it's a quick task, again, you might have the option to get it closed off really quickly and efficiently without having a major impact on productivity. If it's a more substantial change, pulling in additional resources, you may need to consider restarting the sprint and focusing on the immediate issue. There's nothing wrong with doing this. In fact, it may be the right thing to do if there's a known issue or bug and your team develop that functionality. You may be best placed to fix it. You don't have to say yes straight away. Make sure you're comfortable with the ask. You've done the analysis and you can make an informed decision about what's right for your team, your stakeholders, and most importantly, the user. So now I'd like to hand back over to Craig to recap all the things we've discussed today. Thank you.
Thanks, Leah. Okay, I'm back. I was reliably informed that everyone got a lovely view of our mid-renovation box room, but I should have a lovely blue background at this point. Okay, just by way of recap then, hopefully the content that we've talked through today has helped deconstruct the myth that there's such a thing as this sort of quote-unquote perfect sprint, that we shouldn't be driven to despair because our delivery doesn't look like those in the case studies. And in any given environment, there are going to be a whole number of different business realities, and anyone struggling to reconcile that with their Agile framework of choice certainly won't be alone. Things will go wrong, and our time in the classroom won't necessarily have prepared us for that. But as long as we keep the core tenets of agility in mind, there are ways and means to deliver good and often pretty sprints, even in the most difficult of situations. It's worth noting that every one of us on the webinar today has had painful experiences with the kind of issues we've discussed. We've been able to work past them and gain a greater appreciation of their nuance due to both a personal commitment to agility and by looking to more experienced colleagues and confidants for advice. It's also worth remembering that the tactics our presenters talked about today are just examples. Excellent examples, but examples nevertheless, and what works for one team almost certainly won't work for another. Indeed, if we were to run with them verbatim, it'd leave us unprepared to think on our feet as when we started. The approaches we've covered today, though, should make a good addition to any Scrum Master or delivery manager's toolbox. Finally, whilst each problem area is different and requires a domain-sensitive approach, you'll have noticed a series of common themes as we talk tactics. Regular and confident communication with stakeholders in the team, ensuring where possible nothing's done on a whim, and allowing ourselves to fail quickly rather than stall the inevitable. They aren't exactly hand-picked quotes from the Agile Manifesto, but they're key elements regardless, and if we have them in place, it'll help immeasurably when we find ourselves in a difficult spot. Okay, that brings us to the end of the presentation. I hope you've enjoyed it and can take some food for thought away with you. I'm now going to hand back over to Hannah, who's going to walk us through the questions that you guys have been asking us. Thank you, and over to you, Hannah.
Thanks, Craig, and thanks to the team. It's been a really good session. Thank you. Okay, so again, thanks to the attendees for sending through the questions that you have done. So we're just going to take some time now to run through some of these. So first of all, I think we'll start with, there's a question around definition of ready. So the question is, what are the benefits of having a definition of ready? So Charlotte, as you covered that, are you happy to take that question?
Yep, I'm happy to take that one. So this for me comes back to setting the team up to succeed. If we want our team to meet quality standards, coding standards, and our definition of done, they can only really do this if we set them up properly at the start of the sprint. So by this, it would mean, is there an acceptance criteria known and accepted by the team? Has the story been estimated, and is it of a suitable size to be done within one sprint? And are the external dependencies resolved? So the dangers of skipping the definition already are effectively that you expose your team to greater risk within their sprint and you end up with more surprises. In terms of, I guess, the fake news headline, that can often translate to your stakeholders as the team not performing. The other side to this as well, which is sometimes not considered as much, is it can also help a business to understand the work involved in the refinement process and any blockers around this. So taking an example from a project that I worked on a few years ago, we had an issue where the stories were being taken into sprint and they weren't being completed, and there were so many unknowns coming out, the team morale was really low. When we actually reviewed this and found the cause, the problem was that the interface definitions we were working to was so out of date that all of the planned integrations were failing. So the result of this was actually that we had to address the refinement process and increase the amount of upfront work on these stories so that we had better quality inputs into the team and ultimately fewer defects. The other thing that this brought to light for the business was around the refinement process itself. So quite often we see there's an unseen effort and an unseen cost ahead of the sprint that the business can take for granted or just not see. I think that's it for me, Hannah.
Well, thanks, Charlotte. And I say, whoever raised that question, if you've got any follow-ons, then please just pop them in the Q&A. Okay, so quite like this one. So, question: can sprints work effectively inside an organisation or department which is not agile? So, Craig, as our agile capability lead, I think that's well suited for you.
Yeah. So I suppose the straight answer is yes, they can. But I guess we've got to ask ourselves why we would want to do that in the first place. Sprints are just a facet of agility after all, and we've got to make sure that we're doing it for all the right reasons. I guess for the purposes of this question, I'm going to assume we want to get the team used to sprinting, such that if we implement more things further on down the line, you know, that they're ready to hit the ground running. I guess I've got a few recommendations, and they all kind of exist around communication, really. So the first one, it's always good to have a quite senior sponsor in place that's sort of a backer of your approach, and quite a vocal backer at that. I think that sort of lends a sort of perception of validity to the whole thing that those that don't necessarily believe you or believe in it. And it also kind of keeps the question walls from the door, as they're sort of, they'll be able to fend some of that off for you. I think the second point is make sure you're communicating often and loudly. Take people on the journey with you, make sure that people know where you are and why at any given time. One of the sort of key facets, unfortunately, of a waterfall approach, for example, is there are very set milestones and a very onerous change procedure, typically. So what you want to be able to do is make sure that when someone asks you, hey, you know, this thing that we sort of prepped for 4 months and you said would be ready at this point, what do you mean you want to change it because something's gone wrong and you want to change it next week? If you keep that sort of level of communication up, you should be able to head those kind of questions off at the pass. And then finally, it always helps, I find, to keep within the sort of the same vernacular as the existing process, and respect what's going on in that world as well. That again, it makes sure that you don't alienate people, and that people can come on that journey with you without you saying all these kind of strange and crazy Scrum terms that they've never heard of. But I suppose just to go back to the question itself, sprints are just one facet of agility. And I think if we think in an agile way and think on our feet, that can help in all sorts of situations, whether it's waterfall, whether it's any other kind of approach. So just be wary of squeezing sprints into a non-sprint space hole just because we think it's the right thing to do. I think that covers it.
Okay, fab, thanks, Craig. Okay, so moving on to the next question. So question here, what should developers do in the final days of a sprint? Which I think logically, Donna, that sits probably with your section of the presentation.
Yeah, I think that's right. So it's a really good question. I think first I'd just like to look at how to reduce the likelihood of developers not having any allocated work to complete in the final days of a sprint. So I think, as I discussed earlier, it's important that testing commences at the earliest opportunity. And I think this will help to reduce the lag between development and tests. And also, I think ideally developers and testers would work together. So there's a bit of a cycle that the bugs can be fixed as they're discovered. I think probably again, just to recap and reflect on what I said earlier around the T-shaped individuals and ensuring that everyone's responsible for quality. So a great way to kind of implement this approach, because we know the timing and there's all often time constraints when trying to build a team full of T-shaped individuals. So this is a great time to implement this approach and pair developers up with testers. So I think if you do find developers with spare time at the end of the sprint, this will be an ideal time to make it happen. I think aside from that, a couple of potential activities for developers to focus on is tackling tech debt and completing any spikes for particularly challenging stories in the next sprint to help reduce any risks to delivery. And then probably a final one for me, but is caveated because of kind of looking at developers finishing earlier than testing activities, is look at setting stretch goals within a sprint. So this will help to utilise the developer's capacity, but just be mindful when setting stretch goals. If the stretch goals require testing, then you're probably going to find yourself back at square one. Thanks, Hannah.
Okay, thanks, Donna. Okay, let's pick up another question. So, should a sprint goal be specific or generic? What does a good sprint goal look like? And Leah, can I hand that one over to you?
Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, sprint goals should be a specific goal of user-focused delivery that everyone can work towards. It's not just a case of bundling up all the tickets that the team are working on and they think they can manage that sprint. You should be able to, in theory, explain in a sentence, maybe two, what that sprint's actually delivering. You want one goal for the team that they can all agree on and can measure if they've succeeded. And ideally, it should cover all the attributes of SMART, so specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. Obviously, not every sprint goal will be perfect, though. You might start off too generic or you might start off too detailed, but it will develop and improve as the team matures. The important thing is that the team understand what it is they're working towards, what it delivers for the user, and what's the definition of done. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Leah. You can see how some of these elements hang together as well, which is good. Okay, we've probably got time for a couple more questions, so I shall be selective. We've got one here. So, question: the organisation I work for prefer to plan work in excess of 2 future sprints according to existing capacity. What is the attitude of the panel to this type of approach? And again, Charlotte, I think that probably sits well with you.
It does, thanks Hannah. So as a headline, I like it, but joking apart, it can be really difficult to manage your stakeholders when they want to plan months in advance to a minute level of detail and have those milestones. But again, it's a way that you tackle this. It's how you bring them on that journey. And it's all part of the context around this. So if we take it from the start of our delivery, we would produce our epics and we would produce t-shirt sizes. So from that, we are going to produce a rough outline of our delivery based on the information that we have today. Is it 100% accurate? No. Is it useful? Yes. So the key point here is as we move through our delivery and ideally our velocity ramps up in line with this, we can use that average velocity from previous sprints. So we can predict how this is going to change that outline forecast and that end delivery. And it's all about using the information that you have today to predict as accurately as you can. If we outline this approach to our stakeholders, then they're more likely to be accepting of changes, be they move in or move out, instead of it coming across as what they see, slippage at the 11th hour. It's all about setting that context. If, for example, on my plan, I can see that the next 4 sprints tackle key risk areas that are going to be really difficult and velocity may be lower and it may fluctuate, tell your stakeholders that in advance so you can preempt those fluctuations and have that conversation and explain it today ahead of it. Also, play around with your tools a bit. So, for example, if you have Jira, use the version report and see if that predicted end date comes out in line with your overall plan and how it moves with the new information that you've got. It's all about increasing that predictability. Use the information that you've got today to try and plan forwards. Thanks, Hannah.
Thanks, Charlotte. Okay, I'm just having a look at some questions that have been sent through to the classic unmute. Okay, so we've got some questions that are coming through as well whilst you've all been answering the questions we'd received in advance. So I'm going to put Craig on the spot here. Okay, so a question from Rebecca. When should you cancel a sprint? Does this still work when working inside, scaled frameworks that encourage consistent sprint cadences? Would cancelling the sprint screw up the program cadence in effect?
Hi, Rebecca. I guess like every question, it's a yes and no answer. I think that the difficulty here is in those kind of environments whereby that there's a very good reason to maintain your sort of sprint cadence alongside a whole variety of other teams, then cancelling a sprint might be seen as something that's completely inappropriate. However, we've got to consider what might be more inappropriate, and I think cancelling a sprint because what we're about to deliver is now pointless would absolutely be the right thing to do. If there are issues whereby we simply won't be able to deliver the sprint goal, or I think, as was mentioned earlier in the session, that there are things that have changed that are so significant that have led to us needing to sort of cause a cancellation, then unfortunately that's a reality, and that's something that we should absolutely bear and factor into our approach. One of the key facet of agility is we need to be prepared for change and be responsive to that. And in addition, we need to be able to fail fast. And I think both of those things need to be taken into account on every sort of sprint basis. And there should be, in any decent scaled approach, there should be a way to ensure that those kind of things don't cascade up and across the program and introduce risk that we weren't ready for. I think that risk, of course, needs to be considered in advance and planned for. It's probably no different than if we had, for example, a bunch of people fall ill with the same virus that they caught at work. And therefore, we're not able to complete a sprint. And of course, the entire chain and the entire train shouldn't fall down as a result of that. Hopefully, that's a reasonable answer. And it really is yes or no, and on a case-by-case basis.
Thanks, Craig. Yeah, I think I would definitely add it does depend on the reason as to what's gone wrong with the sprint. And like you said, if it's just that the goal's not going to be achieved, or if it's actually things have shifted and you're actually developing something that's now completely changed focus, then yeah. So it's always that context is key, really, as to what the right treatment is for that. Okay, I'm just going to squeeze one more question in, and I'll open this up to the panel, but maybe Charlotte, you can kick us off with it. And again, you'll thank me for putting you on the spot. Okay, so how do you time box a spike? How do you manage a spike effectively? So general thoughts on that one?
Yeah, so the issue with a spike is we're in the realm of unknown unknowns. That's the reason that we're doing it, but it doesn't mean that we can't structure our approach to it. So we still know the broad topic, we still know the area that we're going to be looking at, so we can set ourselves some high-level objectives going into it. In terms of the acceptance criteria, there could be key technical challenges that we have to have answered at the back of the spike. And it may go one way or the other. We may work through a series of options and proceed with it, or we may actually hit a block and say that it's not a valid option to take forward. So I would say 3 Amigos is definitely a good way to do it. Look at that high level criteria, look at what you're trying to achieve. What do you need to know when you come out of this spike?
Anybody else got anything to add to that? I think it was a good answer. Okay, all right. We have now reached our conclusion from a time perspective. So I'd just like to thank my friends and colleagues for putting all the content together and delivering that today, and then obviously taking the panel questions as well. Apologies we haven't been able to get through all of the questions. We will make sure we do come back with answers to those questions, and they'll be included when Karen and the events team send out the slides and the recording as part of this. If there is anything else that you do come up with, please also do send that through to us as well, and contact us. And watch this space on LinkedIn and other social media platforms for our next Agile surgery, which we're hoping to host towards the end of next month as part of our involvement with Leeds Digital Festival. So thank you everybody for taking the time this lunchtime, and I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Guys, bye.
Thanks guys, bye.